Hey everybody, welcome to Conversations. We're so glad that you're joining us. My name is Micah. I am the teaching pastor at Lifegate Church. And in this season of this podcast, Conversations, we are tying the topics into what we're talking about at Lifegate Church on the weekends in our Better series. And so I want you to go ahead and know before we get too deep into things on this episode, that if you haven't watched the sermon at Lifegate Church, pause right now and go and listen to that sermon, because this podcast will make a whole lot more sense if you listen to that first. What I'm going to do in the 20 to 30 minutes that we have in this episode is I'm going to unpack in a practical level what I set up on the sermon, which was introducing this ancient idea called the rule of life. The rule of life, I won't get deep into the history, but it's basically a way of patterning our life after the way of Jesus. That's very intentional. Instead of just kind of wandering through life, doing our best as followers of Jesus to be faithful to the Word of God, be faithful to our relationship with Jesus, what a rule of life is it's an actual intentional thing that we write out even, that allows us to track with how do we grow spiritually, emotionally, mentally. How do we maintain our intimacy with Jesus? How do we grow ultimately in our love for other people in a very real and practical way? So we're going to get into that here in just a minute, but I have a special guest, my favorite guest of all time on my podcast this episode. It is the wonderful Shireen Eldridge. Yes, my wife. We are here in our living room sharing with you for this episode. So it should be a lot of fun. And we have been trying to do a rule of life. And I say trying, if I could type this out, it would be in all caps. We have been trying to do a rule of life, both personally and in our home, for a few years now. And there's been ups and there's been downs. There's been successes and failures, if you can even use those words to talk about a rule of life. But Shireen, why don't you, I've described it in my sermon this weekend, but how would you describe the rule of life to somebody who's maybe hearing it for the first time?
Yeah, I think being a natural goal setter, the first time I heard rule of life, I thought, okay, it's goals that I have to achieve or need to work towards. But actually it's completely, I wouldn't say completely opposite, but very different. It's not necessarily goals you're achieving. It is something you're patterning to get to maybe a goal. But it's more about the way to get there. It's more about your daily habits and routines and kind of your everyday. I mean, really, right? So I think that helped me see it differently from just like, okay, it's New Year's, let's set new goals, or things like that. It's more of how you want to just live your life and being intentional, just really being intentional instead of just going about life and letting it shape you.
Yeah, absolutely. And really one way to say that is the rule of life is more about allowing the Holy Spirit to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit in you, which are just, it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like, that's ultimately the goal. And we can't create any of that stuff in our lives, but what we can do is position ourselves in what we're using this terminology, the unforced rhythms of grace from Matthew chapter 11. We can position ourselves into those rhythms in order for the grace of God to form and shape his love in us. So we're going to do a little screen share here and kind of talk you through really some ideas related to the rule of life that hopefully will allow you to maybe after this podcast create your own little version of that. So fancy title slide there. We won't spend a lot of time on that one, but I do want you to see this quote from Ken Shigematsu. He wrote a book entitled God in My Everything. It's a great expression of the rule of life. And he basically describes the rule of life as it's simply a rhythm of practices that allow us to live well and grow more like Jesus by experiencing God in all things. And the thing I love about the rule of life is it really does encompass the fullness of the way of Jesus. I think we can sometimes have like our spiritual disciplines, our spiritual practices, and then we do everything else in our lives kind of separate from our spirituality. But really the beauty of the rule of life, which really is the way of Jesus, it's about inviting Jesus into every area of our lives.
I think it helps make sense of, gosh, everything is shaping us in some way, right?
Oh yeah, totally.
Everything we do, whether we realize it or not, shaping us in some way. And so this just helps us bring Jesus into the bigger picture and look at everything and say, what's shaping me and what do I maybe need to remove to bring in something different? And it just helps you view your whole life differently, I think.
Yeah, everything is spiritual, for sure. So this little imagery that I want y'all to see, and we talked about this in the weekend service, is that the rule of life, this word rule really is in the Latin word regula, which is where we get the word trellis. And I think this is a really helpful imagery because it helps us to see that patterning our life after the way of Jesus isn't about us accomplishing something or impressing God or even making our way to heaven. This isn't the stairway to heaven by any means. We're not trying to climb the ladder to get to God. This is creating a framework in our lives for us to just simply grow and flourish like a grapevine would flourish. Or as this weekend, I used a clematis plant and its little flowers at the top of the trellis. And
yeah, I think that's a great imagery too, because we can't force something to grow right up on the trellis. Like we can only do the building part. So
Yep, we can just do the steps. So what we're going to do is kind of talk through each maybe layer of this trellis. And there's a lot of ways to write a rule of life, but I have found, I've read a lot of different books on this. I've found this to be one of the clearest ways to do it. So we're going to break our lives up into 4 areas. And each area is going to have different practices that we can implement into our lives. And what we'll talk about is just a very small sampling of the practices. There are dozens of practices that we can implement into our lives on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, but we'll just talk about a few just to hopefully inspire you and stir your thoughts. So at the very root level of our lives are our core practices, the things that we do on a daily basis. I would say this is just how we spend our time on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. The things that are shaping us, and these things are shaping us, and we sometimes don't even realize it, whether it's the time that we go to bed, the time that we get up, the way that we use our mornings before work, or the ways that we use our evenings after work, the entertainment that we engage in, even the substances that we engage in at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, whether it's coffee or having a drink or whatever it might be. Those types of things, when they're done on a real rhythmic basis, they really will shape us and they become root practices. And I think as followers of Jesus, he shows us some really healthy root practices that we can engage in our lives. And I would just mention 3 of them: prayer, and I would add worship to that. Prayer and worship, just connecting with God, scripture reading, and then Sabbath, setting aside a day for worship, rest, and delight. And so, Shireen, as you look at these 3 root practices, what would you say sticks out to you in terms of, like, you would encourage people, if you're starting a rule of life, this is a good starting point for you?
I think, well, first, just off of the things that you were just saying about rhythms in your day, I think one of the things that comes to mind is just our beginning of our day and the end of our day are so shaping to us, I think, like especially how we start our day, right? I think about, like, when I start our days, if I don't get up in time before my kids,
beat the kids out of bed
and our day starts chaotic, like I feel like I can't get a hold of the day. Or even at the end of the day, if I'm putting things in my brain like the news or reading more about stuff happening in the world right now, that can put me in an anxious state before bed. And so I think that's why these practices are so important. I think if you can start your day or end your day with prayer or scripture or worship, I think that's so good. I'm just getting to that place.
Yeah. Honestly, yeah, it's a long process to get to that place too. I mean, I tried for probably 15 years. It sounds crazy. 15 to 20 years to get up early and consistently spend time with the Lord before it actually started happening on a consistent basis.
It's hard.
So
in real life.
It's hard.
I mean, life creeps
different
in.
phases of life with
It's just hard. So I think for me, the biggest thing is that it's not even just one of these, though I think incorporating them, I think it's I think it's more the rhythm of where you put it in your day helps too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I do.
Finding that time that you can give
Yeah.
some of your best time to God is a great place to do that.
I definitely think starting your day with something other than your phone.
Yeah.
Or the news.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think
We've
so.
figured that out finally.
Yeah. We try to put our technology to bed before we go to bed, and so maybe a good hour before bed we want to plug our phones in, and then I know we're both trying to get good about not touching our phone until we've spent some time with the Lord and kind of prepared our hearts and our minds and our souls for the day.
I think Sabbath is good too. I love that it's a weekly rhythm that feels like, okay, I get to try that again in another week if I fail or, didn't feel like it went quite the way I wanted. I don't know if you can fail at Sabbath. I guess not.
No, not really.
As long as you're not working.
Yeah.
You're not really. Yeah. Those are all great places to start. I think those are big ones.
Yeah.
I think it's more about where they fit in your rhythm of your day.
Yeah. So those are some good samplings. And I would say just for a believer that these three, and again, adding worship in there, should just be a normal part of our lives. And it doesn't even have to be daily, but they will grow into daily, I believe, if you start doing them here
I think
and there.
it's one of those things, like, I think about roots, right? And the more there are even seasons, right, where we don't see anything happening in the trees, but the roots are growing.
Yeah.
And I think the
It's
more
good.
you keep working at these things, that even when you feel like nothing's happening, like you might not see the fruit, like your roots are still growing deep. Like you're still putting effort into reading the Bible, praying, worship, connecting with God on a regular basis, that he's still growing those roots, even if you don't see anything happening right then. And so I think that's why this is so important to be a root practice, because even if you don't feel it, or even if you don't see something, God's still using it.
Absolutely. Because you're doing this, you're engaging in this in faith, right? And so it's different than saying, I know if I only eat this many calories this week, I might lose this much weight. I mean, that's a very scientific way to go about our health. But there's not really a scientific way to do this. This is less of a science and more of an art, because it's a relationship and because God does the production. And so all we can do is position ourselves. We can water, tend, plant the seeds, but God is the one who makes it grow and will grow us into love as we consistently give him our focus.
Really. I think one more thing about this one that I love, I think it's such an important one.
It's huge. Everything builds off this.
I guess you don't want to say more than the other ones, but it's important.
Yeah.
Is the more you practice them, I think the more you enjoy doing them. So at first people can look at them and say, oh my gosh, this feels like so much work. Like, I don't enjoy reading my Bible. I don't understand the Bible. I can barely pray longer than like 1 minute. And then I look at my watch and I can't believe I still have more time to go or whatever. But I think the more you do it, the more your soul craves it. At least that's the way I think we've discovered it, right? Like you do a little bit, even the little bit of time that you give, you realize, no, I want more. Like you started getting up even earlier because you so love that time. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but
we're all in
I think that it kind of makes you desire more over time.
That's good. So that's the foundational level of these practices. And then we get into, let's see, I've got my little guy here. Okay. Relationships is the next layer of kind of our lives that we can look at practices. And these are the people in our lives who, I wrote it this way, give and take energy. And that's not meant to sound negative. It's about there are people who take energy and there are people who give you energy, which basically has to do with the life that we have to offer and the life that we receive from relationships. And both of those are important. And there's those types of people in your life.
Like your children.
Yes. Who both give and take. Yes. And your marriage.
And your marriage.
Yes. So
very real.
It's all around. So a few practices related to relationships, community, confession, and then celebration and lament. These are just some basic things, but community being, we're meant to be in relationship with one another. We see this in the life of Jesus, him living in relationship with his disciples, which are really his closest friends. And then confession is really a life of vulnerability, not feeling like we have to put up a mask all the time, put up a front all the time, but there's people in our lives who we can be really honest with and very real with. It's the only healthy way to live. is just living very authentic before a certain set of people. You can't do that in front of everybody,
No.
but there are a handful of people in your life that you can do that with, or you need to find them if you don't. And then celebration and lament, having to do with how we allow the ups and the downs of life to intersect with our relationship with God. And so it's times of joy and it's times of grief, but actually intentionally inviting God into those moments, the good moments, the gratitude, and then the hard moments, the kind of leaning into Jesus and seeking his comfort. But these are disciplines as well. These are spiritual practices we see in the life of Jesus. So same question here, Shireen, when you see these, or maybe there's other ones in the relationship camp that you would say, or maybe some practices that have helped you, that you've seen some fruit from, what would you say?
I think definitely community. I'm definitely more of an extrovert.
Yes,
and
she
I
needs it.
really needed. I learned that really early on in mothering.
Yeah.
I think you learned that about me.
Yep.
That I needed that community, and for me it turned out to be community and confession. We shared very vulnerably with one another, and I realized how much that helped shape me in that season. And it was a small, short season of, mothering littles that I was in that community, but it really helped.
Yeah.
And I think the thing about this is it can change over time. It can be different groups of people for each thing. Like you can have community of friends that you celebrate with, and then you can have some people, maybe it's not even a full group, but a handful of people that you are really vulnerable with. I think one thing that is hard as I'm even thinking about this is like, gosh, our Western culture doesn't really do this very well. We don't slow down enough to have real community. If you think about it, I mean, the way Jesus did, at least, I mean, he lived basically with these guys, right? We don't do that with people around us. And then the vulnerability side, it's really hard to be vulnerable in a Instagram perfect world where you want to be, feel like you have it together. And then celebration and lament. I do think we celebrate, but we definitely don't lament in relationships. I think great. I think we don't know how to do that. And I think that's the whole point of this is learning to practice it with people. I think that's what it's going to take is practice.
Yeah.
It's not it's not going to come naturally. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think you have to practice it.
Be intentional with it. And I think really the phase of life that you're in speaks into a lot of these things. So for instance, community came very natural to us in our college years and even right after our college years, because many of those relationships transferred over into our 20s. But then we moved to Omaha and it was starting new and with kids and, pretty demanding job. And, it very quickly community became non-existent and we had to fight for it. We had to create time in our lives for it. And so you wouldn't think of that as a spiritual practice necessarily, but it very much was a spiritual practice that we had to work towards to say, we got to carve out a certain amount of time every week just for simple relationship. And then you add into that, not just surfacey relationship, but deep relationships. So that's where confession comes in, and then sharing life with one another. And that's where celebration and lament come in. And so I think, I remember reading an article on an airplane when I was in my early 30s, and it basically talked about how difficult relationship is for men in their 30s. And I remember circling that article and taking a picture of that article and feeling like I'm not the only one. Like this is something we're going to have to fight for in our lives. And
then I think as you grow, like we're starting to see it now with having a middle schooler who wants her own community and time for her own community.
True.
Like how do you bring that into your world too? So you're not just navigating and shaping your rule of life, but other people's too, and their relationships and their spiritual growth. So
it's good. Have some friends, find some friends, make some friends. You got to have them.
Got to work at it.
Okay. So then we're going to move on from there into restore. And I'm going to talk about these in a couple weeks on the weekend service. I'm very excited to talk about it because I think this is the part of our life habits that determine your level of health. And what I mean by health is mental, emotional, spiritual, financial health. And so I think this is the part where we can begin to separate kind of the spiritual world from the material world. We
Yeah.
have our spirit that's inside, and we're going to pray and read the Bible. But how does the way that I care for my body, how does the way that I care for my finances, my mental health, how does that really influence my spirit in any way? How does that influence me growing into a person of love? And I would say it very much does, because when Jesus asks for your life, he asks for all of you. And he wants every aspect of who you are, and he wants to engage, as Ken Shigematsu says in that first quote, finding God in everything, experiencing God in everything, and really being able to step into what love looks like, or how to cultivate love in these areas. And so let me flip through here. So here's a few examples of restore recreation, the way that we interact kind of in our bodies with creation or with exercise, activity, health, practices that promote mental, emotional, spiritual, physical wellness, money, practices like simplicity with possessions and generosity with resources. Those are very intentional practices in our lives that help shape our relationship with money. And so again, Shireen, same question, looking at this, thoughts that you have.
Well, my first question is where would our like technology fall under? It'd probably be in here somewhere.
I would think so, because of the impact it has on our mental and emotional state.
That's what I would think.
Yeah.
I think
that's a great thought.
First thought I had was that is one of the things right now in our culture that most shapes us, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Like watching Netflix, news,
social media.
Yeah. Just we're
online shopping all the time.
We're inundated. We're on a screen so much. Our kids are on a screen. Everyone's on a screen so much that it's shaping who we are, whether we know it or not. And I feel like that is actually a lot of our mental, emotional, and spiritual health.
No boundaries with work, because you do emails at any time.
All your notifications that are constantly distracting you. I don't know. That was the first thing that came to mind when I've been thinking about this. Like for us, like we said, putting kind of parenting our phones, as we've heard it said, putting our phones to bed before we go upstairs, and not letting that be the last thing in our brains or the first thing in our minds when we wake up. I think that helps for health. I know also, like on Sabbath, we're trying to be away from technology as much, and we're not TV watchers a ton, so that is not a huge thing. But also then for me, it's recreation. Like I don't love to be outside. I'm an outdoor person. So finding things that I still want to enjoy and that develop you, as a person, and kind of connect you with nature. I know that I do like the beach.
You do?
That's outdoors.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is so much here in this whole area, and we will come back to it because it's such a huge section of our lives. But the big idea here is it is a section of our lives that we often just kind of keep. It's not even that we intentionally keep it away from God. It's just, I think we don't even know what God has to say about these types of things.
That's probably more what it is.
And so I think learning how to experience God in these areas is pretty transformative. And then, so we won't spend a lot of time on this one either, because Pastor Les is going to preach on it, but reach is the last layer of the trellis, the highest layer of the trellis. Who is your life influencing? And recognizing that your life, and all of this that we're talking about is towards the goal of becoming love, which eventually is allowing your life to be a gift to the world around you. And so practices related to your work, related to service, the way that you serve the world around you, and to mission. And I would say, I'll just say this about it. For me as a parent, parenting our 4 kids, this middle one here, service, has really been transformative for me when I began to recognize one of the best things in my life that God can use to shape me into love is these 4 little kids he's given us. Because it just does not come natural to me. Some people can just serve their kids, and it is the joy of their lives to fix their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and make their beds in the morning and fold their clothes. And that's just not really us. And so this has been an intentional effort towards recognizing that God's placed these kids in our life for many reasons, but one of which is God's going to actually use our kids to make us better people and to shape us into the image of love if we're willing to allow him to do that. So any thoughts on this in addition to that?
One thing I love about this is that it's at the top, how you put it at the top of the trellis, and how this is what we're kind of, we're starting at roots and we're kind of growing, building our trellis. And the fact that this is the top, not that this is like the goal, but I think if you kind of set your roots well, like these will come more naturally. In a way, they will come out of love, right? Like that's the whole point. I don't want to just do work just to do it, or serve just because Jesus says we need to serve, and then you end up serving with a frustrated heart, which we know about. Or those, we can do that and we fall into that so easily. But I think if you're naturally getting your roots deep in him, if you're building this trellis slowly, it's a process. Then when you get here, basically you're doing it out of love, right? If that's the goal, to become love, then I like how that kind of seems to work that way naturally.
And I think it helps balance it too. I mean, all of this is built off of Jesus's great teaching, right? The two greatest commandments: love God and love others. And some of us can it can get not easy, but it comes more natural just to love God and to want to just grow in relationship with him and be with him, but recognizing that is intertwined with then turning and loving others. And so that's why I think it's an important level of the trellis.
And remember that this whole thing is such a slow process.
It is. It absolutely is. Yep. Well, I want to jump into just kind of an example of different ways that you can start to look at your life. And so you've got on the left side here the 4 layers of the trellis. And then what I have in the middle column is fruit that is less than ideal, that might exist in our lives today. But then the practices, and I think this is a great thing in terms of developing and starting to write your rule of life, is to reflect a little bit on what kind of fruit is in your life right now. Like, what would people in your life, how would they describe you? But then recognizing that that's more than just personality, or it's more than just I'm just human, but there might actually be practices in your life that are, or situations in your life, or circumstances in your life that are creating that less than ideal fruit. And so an easy one is the roots: anxious and exhausted, the way most people live this life. That is not just normal human life. It doesn't have to be. A lot of times it's related to some practices: late bedtime, tech overload. You could go on about what, ways that we live exhausted and anxious, and actually see that there's things in our life that are feeding that type of fruit. And then how do we actually replace those negative habits and rhythms and routines with things that are a little bit more positive, that look a little bit more like Jesus's life? So we can flip here and see kind of the upside of it. Is, for instance, again, looking at the roots one, that we know that one of the fruits of the Spirit is peace. And it's amazing to think that a better bedtime, putting our phones to bed before we go to bed. Look, even in that little example, is your phone goes to bed at 8, you go to bed at 10. You figure out how to use those 2 hours in a way that's life-giving. You might become more peace-filled. And you might say, like, going to bed, like, that's a spiritual discipline. It's a spiritual practice. Again, everything's spiritual. If it allows you to get up and spend time with God in the morning, if it keeps you from doing things late at night that you don't need to be doing, it's a very spiritual practice.
I mean, how many times have we said, oh gosh, our kids are acting like this because they're so tired?
Yeah, it's so true.
It's true for everyone, not just kids.
It doesn't stop when you're 7.
No,
you're right.
We all need sleep. It's important.
And I want you to see this too, because it's just a lot of this stuff is practical. It might not feel like these are spiritual practices, thank you notes, but that's gratitude, right? And gratitude does something in us. No coffee in the afternoon. What does that have to do with a spiritual life and being grown into love? Well, it might keep you a little less anxious in the afternoon, which might put you a little bit more at peace. It might help you sleep better, which then might allow you to get up better the next morning and have some time to connect with Jesus. So all of these things are interconnected, right?
I love it too, because I think, like you keep saying, we don't think that Jesus is in these small things. I think he cares about all the small things.
He cares about all of them.
He cares about our everyday, ordinary life. That's why I love that verse in Romans.
That's so great. And 2, it's not as though the Holy Spirit has come to me and said, Micah, you are not allowed to have coffee in the afternoon. And if you do, you are in sin.
Right.
This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about ordering our life in a way that's wise and that moves us towards patterns and routines that allow love to be developed in our lives. I love this statement I heard recently, that morality is a command in Scripture, but maturity is not. Maturity is an invitation. And so to grow in our maturity, it's not so much an issue of sin and righteousness. It's just an invitation from Jesus where he's saying, hey, come to me. I mean, it's Matthew 11. Like, if you're tired, if you're weary, if you're burned out on religion, come to me and I'll show you how to take a real rest. Take my ways upon you. And that's just a simple invitation from Jesus. And that's what we're trying to live out here.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So the last little thing I have here is just a blank slide of that. And you can download this PDF. We'll have this on our website or in our show notes. And you could even just draw this yourself. It's pretty simple. We made it that way on purpose.
You can Google rule of life too.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a million ways.
Yeah. There's so many ways.
There's so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
If you're creative, you can do whatever you want.
And I will say, if you're creative, you will love what you find on Google.
Yes.
If you are not creative like me and you want someone to tell me what is a rule of life supposed to look like, you will not find the answer, because there's a million.
I actually think
versions.
This is really great. For people who have never done rule of life, this is a really basic way to start. You can get on there, and I think there are a lot of people who have been working at this for so long, and theirs are a lot. You'll look at it and you'll get overwhelmed. I know I have. And so I think that's why this one's really good, because it's actually pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great starting point, because it's not too much.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think we've gone through it pretty well here. And again, we'll be spending the next few weeks at Lifegate Church talking more deeply into each of these layers of the trellis. But any closing thoughts as we wrap up kind of this introductory talk around the rule of life?
Yeah, I think just basically remembering that this is a slow process.
Yeah.
I think I just thought about that the other day, just thinking, if I really want to become love, this is a slow process. This is not quick. This is not overnight. Just because I write down my rule of life does not equal that it will happen.
Yeah.
It is slow and steady, and it takes time. I mean, it takes time for a plant to grow, and then for blooms, a bud to come up, and then for it to bloom. Like, it's a process.
Yeah.
So to not get discouraged when you don't see fruit right away.
I think that's huge.
We may not see fruit for a while.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, if we're supposed to see God in the world around us because he created it and there are reflections of him everywhere, the world, creation is a place of process, right? I mean, the way plants grow, the way humans are gestating, inside of a mother, there's constantly process around us. And many of us, we put a lot of emphasis and a lot of hope in the power of God, but we don't always understand the processes of God. And what the rule of life allows us to do is understand that there's a process of transformation, that there will be those moments in our lives it's just boom, like he set me free, he delivered me, it was overnight. And I love when those things happen. I want those things to happen in our lives. But the majority of what God will do in our lives, I believe, is if we allow him to just work his process in us, we will actually grow into maturity.
That's good.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us on Conversations. We encourage you to share this with a friend. Let some other people know about it if it's helpful to you. If not, then just move on. Find something else. There's a lot of other podcasts out there. But hopefully you have fun trying to figure out this rule of life thing. Fill yourself with the joy of the Lord as you do it. Yes. Understand that it's practicing the way of Jesus. It's not perfecting the way of Jesus. And I think God delights in your willingness to even just attempt this. So bless you guys as you go after it, and do your best. And as we do our best to pattern our lives after the way of Jesus. Y'all have a good one.